The UK economy shrank by 0.2% in the 3 months to the end of September. It could mark the start of what may be the longest recession on record. The Chancellor warns of a tough road ahead.
What we need is a plan that shows how we're going to get through this difficult period. If it is a recession, how we make it shallower and quicker.
Also this lunchtime. The BBC finds NHS England spent £3 billion on locum doctors, nurses and other agency staff last year, an increase of 20% to fill holes in rotas.
We're all fishing in a relatively shallow pool of staff, so until we address the longer term challenges around workforce, it's always going to be a bit hand to mouth.
Pictures posted on social media show damage to the bridge used by Russian troops to withdraw from the key southern Ukrainian city of Kherson. People across the UK observe a 2-minute silence to remember those who've died in military conflicts. After decades of work, the Amateur Filmmaking Club finally getting the red carpet treatment.
Coming up in sport on the BBC News Channel, England's Red Roses prepare for their Rugby Union World Cup final. Having won their past 30 tests, can they beat the hosts, New Zealand?
Good afternoon and welcome to the BBC News at 1. The UK economy shrank between July and September, confirming what many economists and the Bank of England believe to be the start of a recession. It contracted by 0.2% as households and businesses were hit by soaring prices, higher energy bills and rising interest rates. Britain is not officially in recession yet. That happens when the economy shrinks for 2 3-month periods in a row. In the previous 3 months, April to June, the economy saw growth of 0.2%. But it's expected that we will have gone into recession by the end of the year, and the Bank of England has already predicted it could be the longest on record. Here's our business correspondent, Andy Verity.
This manufacturer in Walsall in the Black Country makes harnesses and cables for ambulances, cars and electric vehicles. It's a growth business that just opened its second factory, but it's struggling with the cost of components and raw materials, which has been surging. One of the reasons business is being held back.
Obviously we need customer support and we work with the customers, but actually we look within, so look at our efficiencies, look at the opportunities we've got to increase output. An increase in output might mean we only stand still, but actually in the current climate that is the best possible outcome. So how's this going, Sharon? Okay?
With much of the world economy slowing, the car makers who make up this company's customers saw a sharp reduction in business, with the manufacturing sector down by 2.3% over the summer, the sharpest drop in over 4 decades.
All subsectors of manufacturing fell in the Q3, and that didn't even happen at the height of the pandemic. And actually, you have to go back to the 1980s for the last time that happened, so over 40 years ago. And what they're telling us is they are struggling with price pressures, global supply chains and labour supply.
Normally, if you enter a recession, that means households and businesses spending less, and governments tend to try and offset that by spending more themselves, or central banks cut interest rates. But this time, preoccupied with inflation, they're doing the opposite. The government's reining in its spending and the central bank's raising interest rates. Many economists fear that could make this recession worse than it would otherwise be. As the post-Brexit UK economy shrank by 0.2% in the third quarter, it began what's forecast to be the longest recession in 100 years, as the only one of the G7 group of advanced economies that still hadn't recovered to its pre-pandemic level.
Well, according to the International Monetary Fund, around a third of the world's economy is in recession this year or will be in recession next year. And that is principally, but not entirely, because of very high global energy prices. We are not immune to that in the UK, and what we need is a plan that shows how we're going to get through this difficult period.
The tax giveaways by the Conservatives in their last budget caused huge damage, but so have the last 12 years of a stagnant economy with barely any economic growth. So we need to stabilise the economy, but then have a plan for growth.
What counts in any party's plans is what the top priority is. If it's to boost the public finances and head off inflation with spending cuts or higher taxes on top of higher interest rates, that may not be compatible with the other aim all parties say they share, to make the recession as short and shallow as possible. Andy Verity, BBC News.
Our economics editor Faisal Islam joins us now. So Faisal, we appear to be inching closer to a recession then.
Yes, so this is, as Andy said, as you said at the start of the programme, 1 quarter over the summer from July to September, where the economy fell. Actually, it was expected it would fall further than 0.2%. So if you're a glass half full type of person, you might think that that's slightly better than expected. But it's the news going on from that right now over the next year. The expectation from the Bank of England and others that we'll see continuing quarters of economic contraction. The economy getting smaller and smaller. That is what would signal that we are now in a recession, and that is the concern. And as you hear, the balancing act, not just for households in terms of what they spend and what they save, also for the Bank of England in terms of inflation versus growth and where they put interest rates, and the government too, ahead of its autumn statement next week.
Other big economies, though, seem to be doing a little bit better, don't they? And there have been sort of positive responses recently in the markets.
Yes, so if you look at the G7, the major economies across the world, then you can look at the quarter, and it happens to be that we're the only country that's fallen. It's probably just park that. That's just 1 quarter. If you look at the trend from the end of 2019, so before the pandemic, past 3 or 4 years, just before Brexit, you do see that it's only the UK that hasn't recovered the size of the economy that was there just before the pandemic. Other economies like the Americans, well, they're up 4%, the French are up nearly 2%. So you see that there's something going on there over the past 3 or 4 years, which is UK specific. Having said all of that, there are some signs from around the world, literally in the past 24 hours, that we might just be starting to turn a corner. Some of that inflation that was caused after the pandemic by supply chains gumming up, could that be turning around? We saw some signs of that in the US inflation figures, and we've also seen in China itself, they're approaching it slightly more liberally, this issue of COVID. Perhaps they'll keep ports and the like open. That led to a massive rise in the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, up 8% overnight.
Faisal, thank you very much. Faisal Islam, our economics editor. The former Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng says he warned Liz Truss to slow down after September's ill-fated mini-budget that triggered turmoil on the financial markets. In his first interview since he was sacked, he also says that he told Miss Truss she would be mad to fire him. Our political correspondent Ian Watson joins us from Westminster. So is he saying then that the mini-budget was all Liz Truss's fault, Ian, and not his?
Well, it does seem to bring to mind, Martin, the phrase by President Kennedy that success has 100 fathers, but failure is an orphan, because Conservative MPs have been moving at some speed to distance themselves from the mini-budget, but now the very Chancellor who delivered that mini-budget seems to be doing much the same thing. He says, "Oh, I'm not washing my hands of it," but all his comments suggest it was Liz Truss's hands that were all over it. He suggests that she was pushing radical measures through Parliament far too quickly, and that he was warning her of the consequences of doing too much too soon.
I said actually after the budget that because we were going very fast, even after the mini budget, we were going at breakneck speed, and I said, we should slow down. Slow down.
And what did she say?
And she said, well, I've only got 2 years, and I said, you'll have 2 months if you carry on like this, and that's, I'm afraid, what happened.
Now, interesting there that Kwasi Kwarteng was talking about slowing the pace after the mini-budget, because just 2 days after he delivered it, he told the BBC that essentially there were more tax cuts to come, presumably unfunded tax cuts to come at that. He also, as you mentioned, Martin, said that it was mad of Liz Truss to sack him as Chancellor, but I'm not sure that the current Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, would agree, because when he was told about Kwasi Kwarteng's remarks today, he said that unless people had a plan to bring debt down, then the markets would react badly. The country had to show that it could pay its way. He brings forward his own plans, of course, on November the 17th. There'll be nothing like the mini-budget, but that doesn't mean to say they'll be popular, because he said again today that he's going to have to make eye-wateringly difficult decisions on tax and spending.
Ian, thank you very much. Ian Watson in Westminster. The NHS is spending billions of pounds each year on freelance doctors, nurses and other health workers, often paying premium rates to fill vacancies. An investigation by the BBC found that this type of spending is increasing dramatically across the UK. Last year, agency staff cost £3 billion in England alone. That's the same cost as hiring around 50,000 full-time nurses. Here's our health reporter, Chloe Hayward.
We have had to use more agency staff, unfortunately, and that comes with a cost.
Hospitals around England are struggling to fill rotas.
We have seen an increase in people leaving. There's no doubt that one of the reasons is around more money.
With wards already full, more doctors and nurses are needed, and expensive agency workers are often the only way to fill staffing gaps.
We're all fishing in a relatively shallow pool of staff, so until we address the longer-term challenges around workforce, it's always going to be a bit hand-to-mouth.
On the ward in Colchester Hospital,
I will be responsible for staffing for the whole of the site today.
Andy Seal is in charge of filling rotas and knows these challenges all too well.
Yesterday, as an example, I thought the emergency department was nice and safe for the evening, and a couple of hours before we had a couple of people calling in sick, and then immediately that changes things.
Overall, the NHS in England spent more than £3 billion on agency staff in the last year. That's up 20% on the year before. And agency spending is also rising in other parts of the UK. In Scotland, it has doubled in the past year, while in Wales, it has risen by over 40%. In Northern Ireland, it is 4 times higher than it was 3 years ago. With so many hospital budgets already very stretched, difficult decisions are now being made.
I think the NHS has been trying to find greater efficiencies for a long, long time. But when I talk to clinical leaders, they're really, really nervous that they're going to have to make some really hard choices if they're going to stay in their budgets. And those hard choices will be things like reducing the number of staff they use, and you can see, or reducing the number of beds they have in hospital. And you can see those are really going to have an impact on the quality and access to patient care.
Improving staff retention could play a key part when it comes to reducing agency spend. So now trusts around the country are taking steps such as improving rota flexibility, offering wellbeing sessions and launching mental health days. But for now, it ultimately comes down to flexibility and money. A junior doctor can triple his hourly rate if he works for agency versus being on an NHS contract.
I wouldn't consider taking the shift if it wasn't paying the market rate, which would be around £50 to £60. I'd absolutely love to go back to being a staff member. It's mainly about the pay. Sometimes you'll only be able to book a shift for 2, 3, 4 days a week, and you'll be very transient in the department. You won't know who the consultants are, the other members of staff, and it can sometimes affect the working dynamic because you're just seen as a replaceable agency worker.
The Department of Health says a long-term workforce plan is coming. But for now, NHS trusts around England are left with little choice but to allocate more and more of their budgets on paying growing staff bills rather than providing frontline services. Chloe Hayward, BBC News.
An inquiry into an incident at a hotel housing asylum seekers in Glasgow, in which 1 person died and 6 were injured, says it was an avoidable tragedy. In June 2020, a Sudanese man, Badreddin Abdullah Adam, was shot dead by police after he stabbed 6 people. An inquiry commissioned by Refugees for Justice found it happened because of a poorly planned decision by the company managing asylum seekers in Scotland to move them out of rented accommodation during the pandemic. Activists from the group Just Stop Oil have announced that they're halting their protests on the M25. Drivers have faced 4 days of delays and disruption on the motorway. Just Stop Oil says the pause will allow the government to consider its responsibilities. The Ukrainian army claims it has made major gains around the southern city of Kherson. It comes as Russia's defence ministry says it's moved its troops from the western bank of the Dnipro River. Moscow has described the situation as a manoeuvre rather than a withdrawal. One of the main bridges connecting Kherson to the Russian-controlled section of the Dnipro River also appears to have been damaged. Footage posted on social media in Ukraine shows that part of it has fallen away. In a moment, we'll speak to our Ukraine correspondent, Catherine Bayorohanga in Kyiv. But first, our Russia editor, Steve Rosenberg, joins us. Steve, what's Moscow saying about this?
Well, according to the Russian Defence Ministry, orders have been carried out and this partial withdrawal of Russian forces from Kherson region has now been completed. And that includes from the city of Kherson. Why is this significant? Well, Kherson city was the only Ukrainian provincial capital that the Russians had managed to capture and occupy since invading Ukraine on February the 24th. And in fact, several weeks ago, President Putin claimed to have annexed Kherson region and 3 other Ukrainian territories, insisting that these would be Russian forever. So these events are quite embarrassing, I think, for Vladimir Putin. Now, Mr. Putin's spokesman today said something quite interesting, I think. He underlined that the decision to retreat had been taken by the military. I have nothing more to add, he said. And I think there's a reason that he didn't want to add anything else. And that is because it's clear the Kremlin has been trying to distance itself from the decision to retreat, because the Kremlin knows there are many people here in Russia who will see this withdrawal as a major blow to Russian prestige, as a setback, and as an embarrassment too for the country. Now, the Russian state media has been pushing the line that this was a difficult decision, the decision to withdraw, but a necessary one strategically. And the TV talk shows here on state television have been urging Russians to back the army, to back the president, not to criticize the Kremlin. And they've been encouraging viewers to seek scapegoats abroad, blaming NATO, America, and the EU.
Steve, for the moment, thank you very much, Steve Rosenberg in Moscow, while Catherine Bayora-Hanga is in Kiev. Well, that was the perspective from the Kremlin, Catherine, but what are Ukraine saying about the current situation?
Well, the message from Ukrainian officials here in Kiev is that they're focused on the military advance towards Kherson city. And we keep hearing about new towns, new settlements that their troops are taking from Russian control. When it comes to this statement from Moscow today, we spoke to an advisor to the Ministry of Defense. He said that they could not take it at face value. They're not sure whether they can trust such a statement from Moscow. Their expectation is that even if there is a Russian retreat from Kherson city, is that it would take several days to come into effect. And that's because you had thousands of troops, hundreds of military equipment in Kherson city, and it would take time for it to be crossed over the Dnieper River and onto the eastern bank where they hold more territory. We also heard this news today of a key bridge across the Dnieper River being damaged. The Russians say they destroyed it as they withdrew, but Ukraine has targeted this bridge in the past, trying to cut off Russian supplies. And also we're hearing from witnesses in Kherson city right now. Some of them are saying that there's still Russian troops in Kherson city. Remember, this bridge, a key bridge, has been cut off, that these troops are stuck and they're coming under fire from Ukrainian forces. So this looks like a messy, potentially a messy retreat by the Russian forces as the Ukrainians advance towards Kherson city.
Catherine, thank you very much indeed. Catherine Bayora-Hanga in Kiev and Steve Rosenberg in Moscow. Thank you both. The time is 18 minutes past 1, our top story this lunchtime. The UK economy shrank by 0.2% between July and September. Analysts predict this could be the start of a 2-year-long recession. And coming up, British military veterans return to the Falkland Islands for Remembrance Sunday, 40 years after the conflict with Argentina.
Coming up in sport on the BBC News channel, we look ahead to the men's T20 World Cup final in Melbourne on Sunday, where heavy rain is threatening to disrupt England's match against Pakistan.
Across the UK, many fell silent at 11 o'clock this morning for 2 minutes to mark the anniversary of the end of the First World War. Armistice Day services have been taking place across the UK to remember those who've died in military conflicts. This year's commemorations including the recently restored Big Ben, striking 11 times. Our correspondent Nicholas Witchell reports.
104 years since the original Armistice Day, the striking of the 11th hour on the 11th day of the 11th month is still regarded by many as the most solemn moment of national remembrance. After the 2-minute silence at the National Memorial Arboretum, a poem was read in tribute to the late Queen.
The country loaded its whole self into your slender hands. Hands that can rest, now relieved of a century's weight.
And at the Cenotaph in London, wreaths were laid, precursor to Remembrance Sunday, when King Charles will lead the nation's tributes to those who lost their lives in war. Nicholas Witchell, BBC News.
40 years on from the Falklands War, a group of veterans have returned to the islands for the first time to mark Remembrance Sunday. More than 250 British military personnel died in the conflict, which was the culmination of the long-standing dispute with Argentina over the sovereignty of the Falkland Islands. Our defence correspondent Jonathan Beale reports from the Falklands.
San Carlos Bay today, a picture of peace and tranquility. But 40 years ago, this was known as Bomb Alley, with Argentine jets attacking a British task force sent to liberate these islands on the other side of the world.
You see that really grainy footage now, but it takes you right back. You know, they're coming in, whoa. Planes screaming through here and everybody just shooting at it, and it was wild.
Gary Marshall and Mark White were here in May 1982, in the first wave of the assault. This is the first time they've returned, and it's bringing back painful memories.
They came over the hill, 2 Picaras, and dropped the bombs onto the actual refrigeration plant, and we lost quite a few guys in that, and one of them was Aaron's Uncle Paul. Though he was wounded during the attack, and he subsequently died of his wounds on the 10th of June on Uganda. You know, 4 days before the end of the actual conflict itself. So, sad. Over the hill from there.
Some of their comrades who never came back, never lived to tell the tale, now lie in this small cemetery. Jackie Giffin has come to remember her brother. Brett Patrick Giffin was one of the first casualties of the war, killed when his helicopter was shot down. He was buried at sea. There is no grave for Jackie to visit. For her, there'll always be a void. But this trip has provided comfort.
Coming here and meeting people, ex-soldiers that were there, has meant an awful lot, because it was real, and they say, oh, I know him and I knew him, and oh, I remember the Gazelles went down, and yeah, so that's very sort of reassuring, very comforting in a strange way.
The distance of time may have made these islands even more remote to many, but the British forces who fought here are still living with this conflict. A war which, though painful, they still believe was just. Jonathan Beale, BBC News, the Falkland Islands.
A ship carrying more than 200 migrants has docked at the French port of Toulon after being denied entry by Italy. The two countries disagree about who should accept the Ocean Viking. France has described Italy's refusal as unacceptable. Those on board the ship were rescued at sea off the coast of Libya. Prosecutors in Belgium say a man who killed a police officer in the capital Brussels on Thursday was on a list of potentially violent extremists. The suspect shouted Allahu Akbar, or God is greatest, during the knife attack, according to a second officer who was stabbed but survived. Former US President Donald Trump has lashed out at Florida Governor Ron DeSantis as the rivalry between the two top Republicans continues to simmer. Mr. Trump said his former political apprentice was an average governor lacking in loyalty. Mr. DeSantis won a landslide re-election in Tuesday's midterms. He's widely expected to run for the party's 2024 White House nomination. A court in Scotland has ruled that a man who claimed he was a victim of mistaken identity is the suspect in a series of sex crimes in the United States. The US authorities say that Nicholas Rossi had multiple aliases and had faked his own death before going on the run to escape prosecution. This report from our Scotland correspondent Lorna Gordon contains flashing images.
Is this Nicholas Rossi, a fugitive from justice who faked his own death, or is he claims Arthur Knight, a victim of mistaken identity?
I'm Arthur Knight, and this is my wife, Miranda Knight.
Now, coverage you can count on.
In America, where Mr. Rossi is wanted by the authorities, the hearing has been making headlines. The court in Edinburgh has heard fantastical claims. The 35-year-old said there was an extensive plot to frame him and that he'd been given distinctive tattoos matching those on Mr. Rossi while he was lying unconscious in a hospital in Glasgow receiving treatment for COVID. The judge disagreed and said the claims were implausible and fanciful.
I am ultimately satisfied on the balance of probabilities by the evidence of fingerprint, photographic and tattoo evidence taken together, supported by the evidence of changes of name, that Mr. Knight is indeed Nicholas Rossi, the person sought for extradition by the United States.
A woman Rossi was found guilty of assaulting while a student in Ohio described him as a liar and said she was convinced throughout as to his true identity.
His eyes and just that dark hair, the hands, I remember those hands, because they assaulted me. They violated me. To me, I didn't have a doubt. He is trying to fool everybody, and I'm glad so many people see through it.
Rossi is facing multiple sex crimes charges in the United States. Charges he denies.
I have many flaws, but to call me a rapist is so out of this world and so unexpected that it's almost comical to think that someone would call that to me.
These have been legal proceedings that Nicholas Rossi, with his extraordinary claims and eccentric behaviour, has attempted to turn into a circus. There's been more twists in this than in many works of fiction. With his identity confirmed, Rossi will now face an extradition hearing, when Scottish courts will decide whether to send him back to the United States to stand trial on the allegations against him. Lorna Gordon, BBC News, Edinburgh.
It's taken me 86 years to get fame. Those are the words of one member of what could be Britain's oldest amateur filmmaking club, which, after many decades, has itself made it to the big screen. The documentary is about the Bradford movie makers, and our arts correspondent David Silito has been to see it.
We are a group of keen amateur filmmakers.
The Bradford movie makers. They've been making films since 1932, with lots of enthusiasm, but not a lot of success. However, things have changed.
I would like to remake Oklahoma, where I'm riding a white stallion.
The film, A Bunch of Amateurs, is a documentary about the club. It tells the story of people like Harry.
Oh, what a beautiful morning.
Here doing his version of Oklahoma. And the documentary's been getting rave reviews. Harry's been all over.
You've been to BAFTA?
Been to BAFTA. I've been to London twice in this last week.
Are you getting used to this show business lifestyle?
Yeah.
Colin has been a member for more than 50 years, and this is his first premiere.
This is more like my line, Sinner, Oh, she dropped out again.
This is a special day for you.
Yeah, oh yeah. I'm looking forward to it, yeah.
But this is about more than just a hobby. A lot of the members are carers. The idea of the film began when Joe, a disability support volunteer, posted a message online about loneliness and isolation.
You talk about very personal things, there's depression and...
Yeah. I have that. I've had that for many years, For my sons, yeah. And it's filming is just, I can actually show the story of my life on film if I wanted.
I think what happens in this film, we're all going to get old. We're all going to be looking for, something to do with our minds. We're all going to be looking for a community. We may lose our loved ones. And I think this club is like an amazing alternative family.
And then there was the main event, the hometown gala premiere.
90 years of movie making. There have been no glamorous premieres, many ups and downs. So today, for the Bradford movie makers, it's quite a moment.
David Sillito, BBC News, Bradford.
Time to look at the weather, and Ben is here. Why is it so unseasonably warm?
Well, Martine, as so often with our weather, it is down to the jet stream, at least in part. Now, the jet stream running to the west of the British Isles here is currently blowing with winds in excess of 200 miles per hour. So we've got a really strong jet high up in the atmosphere. It's dipping a long way south, and that is scooping up some really warm air from around the Azores, across the Canaries, and that strong jet is pumping that warm air northwards. That is why it really doesn't feel much like November at the moment. And last night, provisionally, Scotland and Northern Ireland saw their warmest November nights on records. Temperatures staying above 14 degrees in a few locations. But at the same time, we've seen lots of rain in the northwest of Scotland. In fact, some places here have seen more than 200 millimetres of rain, close to a month's worth for this part of the world in just the last few days. And there is more rain to come in northwest Scotland and Northern Ireland through the afternoon. Very windy across the northern half of the UK, particularly gusty in the southeast of Scotland, but with some shelter from that breeze in northeast Scotland, we've already seen temperatures of 19 degrees and elsewhere 17, 18 degrees, really mild out there. Now through this evening and tonight, this band of cloud and patchy rain pushes a little further southwards, and behind that we have actually got some slightly cooler air, so it is going to be chillier than last night, quite significantly so across much of Scotland. Further south, a little bit less mild than it was as well. But generally speaking, we do stick with some quite mild conditions to take us through the weekend. We will see some spells of sunshine. There'll be a lot of dry weather, but some fog through the mornings. A bit of fog around tomorrow morning, particularly for central and eastern parts of England. That should tend to lift and clear. And then we will see some sunshine spreading northwards as this rain retreats across the northwest of Scotland. So actually most places dry by the end of the day. Not quite as mild as today, 14 there in Aberdeen, but down to the south we're still looking at highs of 17 or 18 degrees. And then for Sunday, Remembrance Sunday, could be quite a lot of fog around for some of these North Sea coasts, maybe inland parts of England and East Wales as well. Could take a little while to clear, but it should do. And then as you can see, most places will see spells of sunshine, but a frontal system likely to bring cloud and rain into Northern Ireland late on Sunday afternoon, 14 to 17 degrees. How long will the mild weather last? Well, it is going to cool down during next week, but only really to where we should be for the time of year. Martine.
Ben, thank you very much. A reminder of our top story. The UK economy shrank by 0.2% between July and September. Analysts predict this could be the start of a 2-year-long recession. That's all from the BBC News at 1, so it's goodbye from me. And on BBC One, we now join the BBC's news teams where you are.